Welcome everybody to this webinar to address the best practices in data collection and evaluation of an internship program. My name is Dr. Juliana Rosa and I'm the Director of Research and Evaluation here at Clover Educational Consulting Group. So the purpose of today's presentation is to help you develop a robust evaluation and data collection plan that can serve several different purposes as you organize your collection for each year of your internship. And hopefully you can develop this plan using some best practices. So some learning objectives for today's training are that participants will be able to explain the purpose of the data collection for an internship program, and there are several purposes. Participants should be able to understand the typical data collection for an internship program and what other internship programs are collecting, and also to create a data collection and evaluation plan with best practices in mind. So there are several purposes for collecting data, and data is really essential for acquiring and maintaining your APA accreditation. You'll find data in your self-study, for your APA public disclosure table, and your annual report online. So data is really integral to that process. You can also use data from your program for continuous improvement. You can determine what's worked well or what might need to be changed or adapted for future cohorts so that you can keep improving your program each year. You can also use data to determine the impact of your program. It could be impact to those who were trained, such as the interns or trainees. It could be impact to those who were served by your interns, as well as impact to your organization and the general workforce. So there are typically various different types of data pieces that are collected by internship programs for continuous improvement and planning, for reporting to funders, for accreditation purposes, as well as to measure impact of your program. So when I'm talking about evaluation, I'm typically talking about two different types of evaluation. So there's that process evaluation that heavily focuses on describing your program, who was served, as well as characteristics of those who were served and activities that occurred. So for internship programs, what that typically looks like is tracking characteristics such as the number of applicants, the number ranked, stipend amounts, hours per week per activities, as well as intern status, whether they're full-time or part-time, for example. Programs also typically collect intern characteristics as well as supervisor and faculty characteristics. This includes demographics such as gender, age, ethnicity, military status, and so on, professional activities that occurred during that year, as well as their educational background. What degree did they receive or what degree are they working towards? For faculty and supervisors, sometimes you'll also see some employment data being collected from them as well. Interns also typically track their hours, hours by activities or maybe their hours by site. Sometimes those logs can also include client information, how many clients were served, as well as what services were provided. On the opposite side of the spectrum is your outcome evaluation. And this type of evaluation really focuses on the impact of your program. If your program is implemented well, what are some of the expected outcomes or some of the expected deliverables that you'll see for that program? And so typically what you'll see is programs collecting intern evaluations, right? This is a requirement for accreditation where supervisors are rating interns on profession-wide competencies and then providing feedback for improvement. There's also the program evaluation piece where interns, trainees, sometimes staff and faculty can provide feedback on how an internship program is going. And some typical constructs that are measured with program evaluation are things like the quality of the program, effectiveness of the training, satisfaction with the training, as well as an intern's confidence and skills, as well as application of those skills. You also have the opportunity to collect supervisor evaluations where interns can rate the quality of their supervision as well as the support that they were provided during their training. And then typically programs will collect graduate and alumni data using surveys. It's very common, but there are different methods as well. where you give the intern and trainee an opportunity to reflect on the program, to reflect on their competencies. Maybe some employment or educational history can be collected during that time as well. So now I'm talking about the different data pieces more collectively across the different purposes. But if you're interested in learning more about specific data that you need for accreditation, I highly recommend attending or listening to one of the webinars that Clover has put together called Clearing the Data Hurdle, Leveraging Internship Evaluations for Successful Accreditation Outcomes. So really recommend that particular webinar for specifics around accreditation and the data you'll need for that. One of the very first things you should do as you're planning your program is to also plan the evaluation and the data collection for your program. And I highly recommend creating a documented plan that can be updated over time. It's really important to create this plan because it gives you an opportunity to sit down and clearly map out all the data that you need for all the different purposes of the data. So for accreditation, if you have a grant, for grant reporting, and so on. It also helps you identify data points that can potentially support planning for future programming as well. It's a really good opportunity to think through what you actually need for the year that's to come. It also assists with smoother collection as well as it increases efficiency. You'll see an example of what this table could look like or this plan could look like, and you'll see that it's very well labeled on who does what and when. And so it really does make collections a lot easier to manage, especially so many collections as you saw in the previous slide. It also enhances the transparency of your data collection and your accountability. It assists with turnover and staff transitions. A lot of time a training director might leave the program and so does all their planning. And so a new training director might come in without that information, have to start all over again. So having a documented plan can really help with transitions. And it also improves the quality of your data collection. When you're deliberate with your planning, the data that you collect is usually much better. So what is an evaluation plan? And an evaluation plan is just simply a document that clearly describes the different pieces of the data collection required for your program. It can also describe the process for data collection as well. And so here's an example of an evaluation plan. There are several different templates out there if you're interested in looking or if you're familiar with evaluation plan that really capture different components. But I found that these 6 components have been the most useful when planning out evaluation for an internship program. So that includes the data that's needed. So what do you need to collect, or what evaluation questions do you have that you want to be answered? What are the outputs or outcomes for your program? So what type of information or items do you need to collect? And you want to be really specific and provide definitions and examples here. There's also the method and the data source that you'll be collecting. So how are you collecting this information and from who are you collecting this data? You also want to specify the timing. When will this data be collected? And also who's responsible for collecting that data. And lastly, and I would argue most importantly, you want to also capture how that data is going to be used. Once you have that data in hand, how will it be used? What will happen to that data moving forward? So here's an example of a process evaluation plan. So this is a plan that's really focused on describing what's going on in your program. So the first example is intern characteristics. I know I have to collect that for ARO reporting and for accreditation, so I'll make sure to add that to my plan. For the output, I want intern demographics and an educational background item. So for here, there's not a lot of detail on what that means. I would highly recommend you expand on this category. So what type of demographics do you need? Do you want to collect gender, ethnicity, race, language spoken at home, military status, and so forth? So make sure to be real specific. I just didn't have the space to do that here. For your method and data source, what are you collecting and how? So an online survey from interns, right, is a simple way of collecting that. I want to do it during the orientation, so that's my timing. And the training director is the one who's going to be introducing the survey and sharing the link during the orientation. How am I using that data? Well, for reporting for ARO, as well as for accreditation, for the self-study, table 6 and 8. But also I want to use the data to review with the training committee at least once a year, maybe in August, so that we can consider some recruitment techniques or if we need to target different populations of students. If you can add a date for when you need to aggregate that data for ARO or when your self-study is coming up, it's a good idea to include dates under this category. Another example is intern hours. Maybe I need my interns to track hours per training activity, didactic, conferences, maybe when they're on site or under supervision, hours by site or rotation, maybe the number of clients that they served and also what services were delivered. So for this example, since I'm collecting client data as well, maybe a tool like Time to Track would be really helpful for interns to use. And so I want to collect that data monthly, right? So I want to encompass the whole month worth of data. And then I want supervisors to collect the Time to Track output, mostly because they have to sign off and approve on the hours that were completed every month. And they can also help with tracking that those interns are completing the hours that they need to finish their internship. But I also want to aggregate that data and present it to a training committee maybe once a year or at the end of the internship program. So you'll see that under the data use category as well. So here's an example of an outcome evaluation plan that focuses on the impact of your program as well as growth. So the first example here is your intern evaluation, which is a requirement for your accreditation. So for the outcome, you put down feedback regarding the intern's performance and progress on competencies. I would encourage you to go a step further and actually list out those competencies. Under method and data source, maybe you're using a fillable Word document that you send to supervisors to fill out. You want them filling that out at month 2, 6, and 11 so you can track the growth of the interns. And then who's responsible? Maybe the training director reminds supervisors to do this when the time comes. So how will you use this data? Well, the supervisor should be reviewing the evaluation results with the interns at least 3 times a year. So that's how that data is going to be used. And then the self-study, when that comes along, you'll be putting together some distal tables with this information. Now for program evaluation, you have to determine how well your program is going, right? So maybe you're interested in the quality of activities for the training, the perceived mastery of competencies, their satisfaction with their training, as well as their sense of self-efficacy and autonomy during the training. So you decide that you want to do an online program or online survey for interns, so that's your method and data source. Your timing would be the mid-year and end-of-year point of your internship. And then an external evaluator might be responsible for this collection as you want the interns to provide really detailed feedback, and perhaps you thought it would be a better idea if somebody externally collected it versus internally. So the data will be used through the creation of a brief report shared with the training committee in maybe January or July or whatever your midpoint and end of year point is, so that you can go through a continuous improvement process. And so this is just an example of one of those processes. So here's some best practices around deciding on what data to collect. So a recommendation is to only collect data that will be usable and feasible, right? If it provides you with some level of utility for reporting, for continuous improvement, or whatever purpose that you need the data for. If it's going to sit on a shelf somewhere and never be used, you don't want to collect that data, right? You find something else that will be more useful to you. You also want to make sure what you're collecting is feasible. Right? If you want to collect extensive patient data from your interns, is that something that's feasible for your interns to collect for you, or should you consider other sources of information? Okay, so if it's useful or if it's feasible. Also consider using existing tools. So there are many, many tools out there already in existence for training programs and for evaluation in general, especially if those tools and measures are valid and reliable. So you want to definitely pick those for your evaluation. Also, use an existing model or theory to help determine what data to collect. And there are several different models and theory around training and learning that you can really use to inform your evaluation. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, it might be really helpful to frame your evaluation using a model or a theory that works well for you. There are several different training models and theories out there. I gravitate towards this one. It's Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of training evaluation. It's just really simple to use, really straightforward. There's a lot of great resources available to help guide the development of your measures for each of the levels of the theory. So I really have had some success with this one. So there are 4 levels, as I mentioned. The easiest level to measure is level 1, reaction. So here you're gauging the reaction of the interns, maybe of the supervisors or other staff, maybe of clients even. Here's where you're measuring things like satisfaction, quality, effectiveness, relevance of training, and engagement in training. The next level is level 2, and learning is a little harder to measure around knowledge. Have they gained any knowledge from their training? And so typically you can measure that with a quiz or through a presentation, or there's different methods to measure that. The skills that they acquired, and so this is things that you can observe as well as self-reported skills, attitudes, their confidence and self-efficacy and intentions. Level 3 is behaviors, typically behaviors that are observable. So the competencies and the intern evaluation would fall under this level. Also, it could be behaviors that are self-reported from the interns themselves and the trainees. Level 4 is a little more complicated, and it is a level that typically isn't evaluated commonly in our programs. But we have started gravitating toward pulling more employment data, and I don't mean just a year after the internship. I mean collecting this data for long-term retention data, so retention in the area. It could be the regional area. It could be retention in the field. So looking at retention rates for your interns over time, licensure rates as well for interns over time. And then even more complex would be return on investment of training these interns in your program to your organization as well as to the workforce. So I like to use these 4 levels as I'm planning out all my tools, as I'm planning out all my measures. I kind of think of where do these all fit. And so if you want to learn more about this, I highly recommend that book that's listed there at the bottom. That was published in 2016, but there's a lot of great resources online too that really focus on how to implement this model if you're interested. But again, there are other models that you can use for training evaluations. So another best practice consideration is when you're deciding on what methods to use. So how do you even decide that? So like I mentioned before, only collecting data that will be useful and tied to tangible deliverables like your reports, your planning, continuous improvement. So that's really important too with your methods, right? So if you're considering collecting focus group data, but you don't have anybody to analyze that and put it in a report or to share the findings, then it's not going to be a useful method to use, right? You might be better served with a survey, for example. Also, applying the principle of equifinality by using different methods to measure a very similar thing. So, for example, with intern evaluations, we're looking at competencies, but also asking interns to rate their own perceived competencies as well, right? So you're collecting the same construct, right, which is competencies, but you're collecting it in different ways. So I highly recommend doing that as often as you can, just so that you can do comparisons of that data and check for quality. And then consider using both qualitative and quantitative methods for any of the particular data that you need. So examples that are commonly used: knowledge tests, presentation ratings and observations, surveys, observations, interviews, focus groups. Those are all really common that can be used throughout both the process and the outcome evaluation. If you are just considering using surveys, for example, You can still implement some qualitative questions or open-ended questions in that survey so that you can get richer information for your evaluation. So really consider using both. Additional best practices around deciding on which methods to use includes considering moving all your tools from more traditional method of collection to online. This can include using tools such as SurveyMonkey, Smartsheets, Google Forms, Qualtrics. There are so many other platforms that you can choose from to collect your data. And the reason why this is a recommendation is because of the features that these tools have. These tools can help program logic, so you can skip through questions based on your responses. It can also help with data checks and data quality by restricting responses or providing error messages if something is entered that's not in accordance to what you were expecting. It can also help you set automatic reminders, and I do quite a few reminders during a collection. I send out the original survey, for example, then send a reminder a couple days before the due day, on the due day, and then past due as well. And so you're able to set these up automatically before you even launch, and then you don't have to worry about it anymore. You can also set up some notifications so when a survey is completed, you get notified that there's a new survey to review. What I especially appreciate, and this is a new area that's expanding for these tools, is the data reporting and dashboard features that are available. So many of these tools will have graphs and charts that you can pull right out of the collection and use, and is constantly being updated as new surveys or new information comes in. So really highly recommend for a short-term training program that only lasts a year. You might need information really quickly. So having those set up is really efficient and takes away the time that's required for you to enter the data, you to process and clean the data and analyze the data. The software is doing it for you. Also, as I mentioned, I'm really big on setting clear due dates when I send out any requests for data, and also sending reminders. And so I send several reminders to folks around when it's due, before it's due, and then when it's past due as well. So at least 3 reminders throughout each of those collections. So when determining best practices around the timeline, it's recommended that you measure outcomes longitudinally when you can. For example, with the competencies, if you're measuring at 2 months or assessing at 6 months and then 11 months, you are going to see some growth, hopefully, based on the program. But also consider that for some other measures as well. For example, for a program, I might be interested in measuring the intern's autonomy and self-efficacy around providing services. And so at the beginning of the year during the orientation at the intern demographic survey, I might have a couple of items that ask about self-efficacy and about autonomy. During the mid-year program evaluation survey that's sent out to interns, I might ask those questions again. And then at the end of year evaluation survey, I might ask those questions one more time to interns to see if there's been any growth in their sense of self-efficacy and autonomy. So really highly recommend embedding some longitudinal measures whenever possible. Also consider the time it takes for an outcome to occur. So like my previous example, if I don't believe that autonomy and self-efficacy can be impacted in a year, that timeline for collecting that information is not accurate. I might have to consider maybe doing a pre-collection of those factors, maybe then collecting again at the end of year, and then again maybe in their graduate survey later on. Maybe that gives more time for change to be observed. So really timing is essential for when you're collecting information. Also, you want to consider timing for the reports that you need or how you need to use that data. Right? You don't want to set unrealistic expectations and where you can't use the data if the timeline doesn't match with reporting and when you're making decisions. So timing is really essential for a successful evaluation plan. So some best practices consideration around data reporting and use. So this can be a whole separate webinar, as there are a lot of considerations when you're talking about reporting and use. But when you are thinking about your evaluation plan, make sure that you have a plan for setting up a comprehensive database where all the data that you said you were going to be collecting in your evaluation plan lives. And to make sure that that database includes a very clear code book for your use. This is really essential when self-study time comes around. You have to pull longitudinal data. If it's all in a centralized location, it's a lot easier to access that information. Also important for grant funding, lots of grants that fund this type of work are multi-year grants. So having that database will be really essential for reporting for grants. And also for transitions. So if the training director role transitions to a different individual, having access to that database can really help with that transition and not slowing down the accreditation self-study process. Also, determining how to use the data is really important. Really consider the stakeholders you're reporting to or you're sharing the data with when you're deciding how to share it. For things like accreditation, it's a lot more strict on the format and how you share data. So make sure that you have that embedded in your evaluation plan and you're familiar with what's required. But for things like presenting to a training committee or to your organization or to staff, consider different methods of presenting that data. It can be just brief memo, it could be a presentation, dashboards are really effective, or a full-fledged report. But really the key takeaway here is involve those stakeholders in the decision on how to consume that data or how to use that data. And then you can plan that out in your evaluation plan. So some key takeaways for our webinar today is to make sure to create a data collection evaluation plan that works well for your program. So everyone's evaluation plan will be different depending on your program and making sure it fits your needs. You also want to make sure that you're focusing on the data pieces that are necessary for reporting, continuous improvement, and demonstrating the impact that you want to demonstrate. So it should be comprehensive, but also be useful to you. Use existing models, theories, and tools to develop your plan. You don't have to recreate all those things that are part of the evaluation plan. You can use what other folks have used in the past successfully. So don't feel like you have to create everything from scratch. And also monitor and update your plan as your program evolves. And I haven't mentioned this yet, but it's really important that your evaluation plan is a living document that you're updating every year or however often it makes sense for your program. Your program is going to evolve, so your evaluation and data collection needs will probably evolve as well. So making sure that plan stays updated. Thank you so much for joining me today to learn a little bit more about evaluation and data collection planning for internship programs. If you have any questions, please feel free to join us for a consultation call. Again, thank you for joining today, and I hope this information was helpful to you as you plan the evaluation and data collection of your own program.